Welcome back to History on a Hod. I'm Cap'n Boz. We saw last time how the American detachment at Fort Boyer had won a surprising victory. Although General Andrew Jackson was not physically present during the battle, his defensive plan was clear to the fort's defenders. With the victory, the Americans had denied the British the use of the port of Mobile for their southern plans. But to Jackson, he realized that the root of his British problem was their military base in Spanish Pensacola. Pensacola was the place where the British had armed and trained Native Americans with the use of muskets to be used against the American settlers in the South. Pensacola was the place where the Royal Navy could supply and harbor their ships operating in the South. Pensacola was the place where the British Army was now amassing troops for their attack on New Orleans. To Jackson, it was a no-brainer. Pensacola had to be neutralized as a British haven. He would attack and seize Pensacola from the Spanish, and simultaneously remove the British and leave the political and diplomatic consequences of his actions to President Madison to deal with. So, on November 2, 1814, with a combined force of General Coffee's command and his troops based in Mobile, General Jackson departed Fort Mims and proceeded south towards Pensacola. The die was cast. Part of Jackson's force marched through this area, along the eastern shore of Mobile Bay at what is now Daphne, Alabama. On November 5th, with his troops camped near this oak tree, it is said that General Jackson climbed onto a tree limb and gave a rousing speech to his troops on the eve of battle. It is here that I ran across that roadside historical marker commemorating this event, and the city of Daphne has created this park surrounding this great oak. Believe it or not, this is the actual oak tree that General Andrew Jackson stood on and addressed his men. This tree is over 215 years old. Now that's incredible. The next morning, November 6th, they marched into attack positions just to the northwest of Pensacola. There were two major forts in Pensacola. The first was one in the center of the city, Fort San Miguel, or, as the British referred to it, Fort George. The British had built the fort when Pensacola was a British city during the time of the American Revolutionary War, and it was ceded to the Spanish in 1781. They renamed it Fort San Miguel. The second fort was named Fort San Carlos de Barrancas, or simply Fort Barrancas, near the entrance to Pensacola Bay. The Spanish had given this fort to the British for them to use. Jackson's plan was to attack each fort in succession. First, he would depart his assembly area and march along the western shoreline and approach Pensacola from the east. and then demand the surrender of Fort George. If the defenders refused, Jackson would assault the fort and wipe them out. Once Fort George was subdued, he would march on Fort Barrancas and conduct a deliberate attack on the fort, or surround it and place it under siege until the defenders surrendered. It was a fairly simple plan. British and Spanish troop strength at Fort San Miguel consisted of around 100 British infantry soldiers, about 500 Spanish troops, and an unknown number of Seminole warriors. They were also equipped with several cannons. The entire British and Spanish force was placed under the command of the Pensacola Spanish Governor General, Mateo Gonzalez Manrique. Meanwhile, Jackson was marching his forces around towards the east-southeast, coming down along the shoreline of Pensacola Bay and around from the east into the city, where he established his camp for the night, at the site of today's Seville Square. The Americans clearly outnumbered the combined British and Spanish forces that were defending Pensacola and Fort George. Seeing that he had a tactical superiority, Jackson wanted to avoid unnecessary casualties. Jackson sent his aide-de-camp, a Major Henry Pierre, under a white flag of truce to deliver a message to the Spanish governor, who was holed up here at the Spanish fort. The message demanded the Spanish relinquish control of both Pensacola forts to the Americans. However, as Major Pierre approached the fort, he was shot at by the Spanish garrison. Although he was not hit, he withdrew back to the American lines without delivering the message. Jackson sent a second messenger, a Spaniard this time, and he was allowed into the fort to deliver the message. In this message, Jackson proposed that the Americans be allowed to occupy and guard both forts in conjunction with the Spanish troops. This would accomplish three things in Jackson's mind. First, it would remove any British from the forts and deny them the strategically important port of Pensacola. Second, it would permanently place American troops at the forts, thus allowing Jackson to control Pensacola against any future military operation. And third, it would ensure Spain's neutrality in the conflict. But Manrique rejected the offer. And so, left with no choice, Jackson would attack the fort, along with a defensive blockhouse guarding the approach to Fort George on the following morning. The British forces at the fort were clearly at a tactical disadvantage. After seeing the size of Jackson's force that had moved in during the evening of November 6th to attack Fort George, the British commander decided to evacuate most of his troops out of Fort George under the cover of darkness to the Royal Navy ships that were anchored in the harbor. He would abandon his Spanish allies to their own fate. Once the British troops were aboard the frigates, the ships were then repositioned to the west, out towards the entrance to Pensacola Bay, and anchored in front of Fort Barrancas. At dawn on November 7, 1814, Jackson ordered the initial attack on the Spanish blockhouse south of Fort San Miguel, located near the modern-day streets of Halifax and Government Streets. The 3,600 Americans easily overran a detachment of about 20-some-odd Spaniards. Jackson then pivoted the attack towards the north and ordered Major Pierre to lead a frontal assault against Fort San Miguel, located here, where I'm standing. The remainder of the force would flank the fort from the east, this way cutting off any retreat by the Spanish and the British. The attack went ahead nonetheless, and the American frontal attack was met by strong Spanish resistance in the center of town, by a line of Spanish infantry supported by an artillery battery. Undaunted, the Americans charged a line and engaged the Spanish troops in hand-to-hand fighting. They easily overwhelmed the enemy line, forcing the remaining Spanish to flee back into the fort. The Americans had only suffered light casualties during the attack. Just as the Americans were preparing for the final assault on the fort, the Spanish surrendered. Governor Manrique suddenly appeared at the fort's gate with a white flag in hand, and he agreed to surrender all Spanish forces on any terms Jackson put forward, as long as he would spare the town from destruction and looting. Jackson agreed, and Fort San Miguel formally surrendered on November 7th. But not so with the remaining British troops. They would escape to the safety of Fort Barrancas, some 14 miles to the west. This fort had been in British hands since the beginning of the war, and it was now being reinforced with considerable manpower. Fort Barrancas was now a very formidable fortress, with a substantial number of British troops defending it, supported by many large Royal Navy ships anchored just offshore. When you return for Part 11, we'll take a detailed look at the remaining events of the Battle of Pensacola. What happens during the second phase of the battle at Fort Barrancas? Do the British ground and naval forces overwhelm General Jackson and his men? Stick around for the exciting conclusion to the Battle of Pensacola and the series. Next time on History on a Hawk.